Welcome to Leadership Explored, the podcast where we dive into what it really means to lead in today's world. I'm Ed Schaefer, joined as always by my co-host Andy Siegmund. Today, we're talking about something leaders love to hate, bureaucracy. It's slow, it's frustrating, and it's everywhere. It's often blamed for inefficiency and frustration, but is it really the villain? As organizations grow, bureaucracy often gets a bad rap. But is it inherently bad, or is it a necessary, misunderstood part of scaling teams, maintaining quality, and building sustainable success? If it were truly useless, it wouldn't keep coming back in every organization. So maybe it's time to stop complaining about it and start talking about what it actually is and what it's for. We're exploring where bureaucracy helps, where it hurts, and how leaders can be more intentional about the processes they put in place instead of letting them quietly run the show. So Andy, have you heard people complain about bureaucracy in places you've worked, and what do you think is behind the frustration?
Yeah. So, Ed, I feel like the bureaucracy complaint is probably one of the oldest gripes in the book, right? Everywhere you go, it's oh, we've got this process or this thing that we have to do, and we're just going to kvetch about it as much as we can, right? And this goes from like, I don't know if you had jobs as a teenager, but I can remember people complaining about things that are functionally bureaucracy while I was working at a grocery store, all the way up to what I do for a living today. And I think I think the understanding or the like frustration comes from a couple of different places, right? One is I think inherently people don't like being told what to do or how to do a thing. Two, I think that oftentimes people don't understand why we do the thing the way that we do the thing. And three, I think everyone likes to complain about something, and it's very like the lowest hanging fruit to complain about is a nameless, faceless thing, right? A system or bureaucracy, right? It's almost a cliche, or perhaps it actually is a cliche. And that's something that oftentimes we can have those gripes about and not feel like we're getting the catharsis of complaining about something without actually having to throw any individual under the bus.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I do think a lot of that frustration is legitimate. A lot of bureaucracy is old or has just been in place for a long time or over engineered in certain ways. And I think what strikes me the most about this is that a lot of people complain about bureaucracy without really knowing what it is. Like, I think if you asked most
Yeah,
people to define bureaucracy, they probably couldn't even
it's
define
the
it.
thing I complain about.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think this is a good place to pause and ask, what are we even talking about when we say bureaucracy? So the classic definition comes from German sociologist Max Weber, and he said bureaucracy is a way to organize complex work, especially when you need consistency, fairness, and scale. He outlined six key elements for bureaucracy. The first one is a division of labor, meaning that tasks are divided among individuals based on expertise, which allows people to specialize in whatever it is they do best. The second part is hierarchical structure. And it means that a clear chain of command exists where each level supervises the one below, ensuring accountability and order. The third trait is formal rules and procedures. So, this is just saying we have established guidelines that say how tasks are performed and just promotes consistency and predictability. The fourth one is impersonality, which is to say that decisions are made on objective criteria, not personal preferences, ensuring that there's fairness and equality as best as possible. Fifth is a formal selection or merit based employment. And this is the idea that roles are filled based on qualifications and performance. So we're emphasizing merit over favoritism. And then the sixth part, which I think is kind of my favorite, is there's a career orientation. And it's this idea that employment is seen as a long term career with advancement based on achievement and seniority. And when we do it this way, employees are committed to the organization and its goals, and the organization is committed to their employees and investing in their development. So the original idea wasn't to frustrate people, it was to help things run smoothly, make sure that we had consistency and that we could share information. But definitely when it calcifies or grows out of control, that's when bureaucracy can become a problem. So, Andy, when you hear that list, does that sound like a helpful system or something that would naturally go sideways in most organizations?
And I feel like helpful is an understatement, right? I think, if you're talking about a a group that's larger than, I don't know, a prototypical two pizza team, right, where everything can move quick and fast, and everyone knows each other pretty intimately, it seems like a necessity to have some sort of systems and procedures in place. I think where we kind of lose the forest for the trees is focusing too much on those systems, or forgetting why they were created and not inspecting whether or not they're still serving those needs.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the big narratives that comes up anytime we talk about bureaucracy is the idea that no process equals freedom. Like, oh, if we just ditch all the red tape, suddenly people will be more creative, more agile, more productive. And I mean, it does sound appealing, but I don't know if that actually can scale in most
Well,
cases.
forget scale here, right? So I think you're totally right, right? I don't want to like cut you off and be like scaling's not the issue, but you know when we think about systems or organizational principles, right, it's important to remember what they're relieving us of, right? So if you think, like, let's just narrow it down to like the most basic things, right? So if you wake up in the morning, Ed, and you don't know what you are going to do with your day, right? You don't know what order, so you don't know what you need to accomplish, you don't know what order you're going to accomplish those things, you don't know what you need to like, if you have to make a choice for every single thing that you do for the entirety of your day, right, and this is just like you existing as a human being, you're going to be totally overwhelmed, right? You have to outsource those decisions to the sorts of things that you make once, right? You're going to brush your teeth today, you're going to eat two or three meals today, you're going to, I don't know, make your bed and put on pants, or whatever. If you have to make a conscious decision for each one of those things, you're never going to get anything done. Like, you're going to spend all of your energy working on the least important stuff just to like be a functional human. Never mind getting anything accomplished. And I think that scales up to the organization too, right? If you have to decide how you do something every time that you do it, like, forget freedom, it's chaos.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned the two pizza teams earlier, and I think the truth is that yes, small teams can get away without much structure. When you've got five people who are all sitting in a room together, you don't need as many formal processes to coordinate. You just might talk or improvise and move fast, and it works for a while until it doesn't, right? Until it hits a point where it's no longer sustainable or it doesn't work because as you grow, as the work gets more complex, then the cracks in the lack of a system start to show. And not having a process will ultimately start to cost you in some way. And like you said, if you don't have a process, it means you're relying on your memory or heroics or hallway conversations. And I do think it leads ultimately to chaos or missed handoffs or communication breakdowns. Maybe people start to burn out, or we're spending a lot more time in meetings trying to understand what we're doing as opposed to working towards the work itself. So I don't think the absence of bureaucracy is really better, maybe in the short term, but definitely at scale, it's not sustainable. You need structure, but it's not to control people. It's like you said, it's to support them, to help coordinate across teams, ensure repeatable results, or keep the whole thing from collapsing under its own weight.
Yeah, and I think it's like, I like this idea of an external brain, right? And this, and I think I was introduced to this concept on like a Ryan Holiday podcast or something like that. But he talks about maintaining a book of important things, or things that you want to remember that you can outsource to, right? Most of us will either use OneNote or actually have a literal notebook like I do during meetings, right? Because you can't keep everything in your headspace. And I think bureaucracy works that way for an organization. And I think when we're talking about scaling, or when we're talking about growing an organization, it's it's critical that we implement those processes, right? Because one of the things that this is such a well-trodden path is founders and CEOs of startups will have everything run through them, and they will be the person who drives sales and delivery and all these other things. And they're, oh, well, I'm allergic to process or I hate process. But the reality is that means that they can't delegate anything, right? And that prevents an organization from growing when you can't delegate, right? So it makes it harder to hire because you can only hire people that you super duper trust for whatever reason, and even then you kind of have a harder time letting go. So I think like processes, bureaucracy, it's critical for scaling. It's critical to reduce like the intellectual load to do things, and it kind of works as this external brain for an organization to be successful.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that's a great point. We probably all need to start thinking about bureaucracy differently. And I think if we did think about it differently, we'd have a different mindset and approach to it. Where if we stop viewing it as a blocker and then view it instead as an enabling system or an enabling constraint, something that actually supports people, that can help us create clarity, consistency, coordination, something that preserves institutional memory, reduces cognitive load, and makes it so everybody doesn't have to carry everything in their heads all the time. Yeah, I think when you do that and it's good bureaucracy, it does. It works like an external brain for the organization. It helps us enable repeatable outcomes with different people in different places, and we don't have to reinvent the same stuff over and over again. So that I think in that sense that can create a form of stability and alignment, even if the people who are involved are changing or there's turnover or they get new jobs in the company or whatever. Um, and it can help with things like we can maintain research integrity, or it could support continuity across teams. It could make onboarding smoother. Just really any area where there's invisible work that this structure could help with and make it smoother, or especially something like hiring, you may not onboard that often, and if you have to reinvent it every time, that's a lot of effort and energy that a structure and a system might be able to help with. And if you have
Mhm.
structure already in place and then you just rip it out with no plan, it's not freedom really for most organizations. It's almost always like collapse or free fall and leading to problems. So I guess I would say if we think about bureaucracy differently, we could say when it's well designed, it's not about control, it's about coordination. It reduces decision fatigue, helps people move faster, and lets teams operate without relying on the tribal knowledge or guesswork. So, what do you think? How does well-designed bureaucracy actually make work easier or protect people's time?
Yeah, I think I think it protects people's time by being consistent and understanding what expectations are and what's coming around the corner. And as we were having this conversation, I was thinking about a conversation I had with a running coach where I was. This was before I started working with a coach, and the colloquial term for not having somebody coaching you is that you are a quote unquote self-coached athlete. And he asked me like, oh, so like how do you plan your run week or whatever? I was like, oh well, it's just kind of random and what I feel like. He goes, oh, so your coach just programs random things for you. And I was like, oh, like I hadn't thought about it in that context, right? I was thinking about what I was doing is like, oh yeah, I'm going by feel and vibes, and that's a good thing. And he kind of pointed out like, no, you're going by chaos and lack of foresight, and that's a bad thing,
Yeah.
right? And well-designed bureaucracy, it helps create that structure and create those expectations, right? Um, you know, one of the organizations I worked in previously had what they called the rhythm of the business. And it was, at the end of the month, the last week of the month, we had monthly business reviews. And these are the things we're going to go over in those monthly business reviews. And then you kind of worked backwards from that on all the things that you were working on,
Hmm.
right? So you knew not just what to report, but when to report it and in what format it was going to be reported. It's a big part of the institutional knowledge. And that also, you can then go into those meetings. If you're going to go into a monthly business review, you know exactly what the expectations are, right? So if you're leading that call, you know exactly what you need to ask and all of the bases that you need to cover. And if you're the person who's prepping to be questioned in that call, you know all of the questions in advance, right? Like you read the answer sheet, right? So that way you're talking about outcomes and strategy, not wasting all the time aligning on data, right? And that's a bureaucratic mechanism, right? All mechanisms are functionally bureaucracy, and they should be enabling, right? They should be getting us closer to doing the real work and wasting less and less time trying to figure out what the hell the work is.
Yeah, absolutely. And once before you've mentioned that when we were preparing for this, you mentioned that if bureaucracy isn't maintained, it'll tend to collapse or maybe take over, and there's some entropy around it. Do you maybe want to unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah. So, give me 1 second. I just want to get the actual definition of entropy here because um, okay. It's a measure of thermal energy per unit temperature that is unavailable for doing useful work. It's also so it's yeah associated with states of disorder, randomness, or uncertainty. And my understanding of entropy is that our whole lives are a battle against entropy, right? Everything we do, right? You clean your home and immediately entropy walks in the front door, and you're gonna have to clean your home again at a later point. It will not just stay indefinitely clean, right? Your body's the same way, right? Everything is subject to entropy. And I think it's a good concept for bureaucracy because one of the things that we see, and you see this a lot at organizations that are struggling under the burden of bureaucracy, is that they build, but then they never take away, right? So it's like I think we've all have a family member or a friend or someone who buys but never discards, right? So just gradually their home gets cluttered and filled up with stuff, and then they're like, well, I've got all these things and now I can't do anything, and they feel kind of claustrophobic about it. And bureaucracy does the same thing, right? And I think it's important that we question what we've built and whether or not it's still serving our purpose, right? You can kind of Marie Kondo your organization's bureaucracy, right? Does this still bring me joy? But it's something that we often forget to do, right? We build a process perhaps unthoughtfully, and then it stays forever, or we get into this, oh well, we've always done it this way sort of thing. So I think what I'm getting at, Ed, is I think we have to be careful on both sides, right? If we're going to implement a process, we need to be deliberate and make sure that we're implementing a process that solves a problem that is frequently recurrent. Otherwise, we can probably figure it out each time it happens. And then also, we should look at our processes and ask ourselves and ask the organization, is this still serving us in the way it's intended? If the answer is no, we should figure out how to fix it so that it's doing us a favor rather than slowing things down.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think we probably, both of us, I know for sure, and probably most people who are listening to this have at some point either been involved in new bureaucracy trying to be rolled out, but it's not deliberate enough, or there's not intention behind it, or someone doesn't own it, and then it just collapses and disappears, and no one is following the process or procedure, or the other way around, where you come into, say, a new company, and somebody goes, "Oh, well, here's the process book. Here's the process that you follow," and you start going, "Well, why do I do this and why do I do that?" And it's like nobody has an answer for why. It's just, well, this is how we do things now. And it's almost that like cargo cult type mentality of we don't know why we're doing it or what the use is, but everyone just does it because that's the behavior that we do. And I think this takes us into one of the most common ways that bureaucracy breaks down, because even when it starts from a good place with good intent, which I think most bureaucracy probably does start from a good place with good intent, if no one ever stops to check if it's still useful, then that good intent can very quickly and quietly turn into a bad system. There's a book I really like called The Delicate Art of Bureaucracy by Mark Schwartz. And in that book, he argues that bureaucracy isn't inherently bad or good, it's just how you use it. So when it's thoughtful, it can be lean, adaptive, and enabling. But whenever it goes wrong, it'll become bloated, rigid, or maybe coercive. And at that point, it's no longer about supporting good work. It's about protecting the system from failure at any costs. And he shares a metaphor that I think came from a colleague of his. This was in an interview. I don't think this was in the original book, but he says, imagine that you're hiking up a hill and you're a rock collector. And so you really like cool rocks. And every time you see a cool rock, you're going to pick it up and toss it into your backpack. And you just add them one rock at a time. No big deal, right? It's fine. But at a certain point, your pack just keeps getting heavier and heavier. And at a certain point, it's too heavy for you to carry and you can't climb the hill anymore. And he says that's how bureaucracy often grows. We add a new rule or a new control, and we do it for some reason, and it's probably a good reason. But then over time, the weight starts to add up, and no one's ever going back to empty the pack. Like you said, no one's cleaning up the bureaucracy or validating that those procedures still make sense or we're still doing them. And then you end up with systems like, well, someone lost a file once. So now there's a 3-step checkout process that you have to do to get the file out. Or someone missed a deadline. So now every team has to submit 3 different progress reports a week and update their status every day or something like that. And then all of a sudden, what started as a one-time fix for a one-time problem becomes a permanent burden on everything. And I think there's a real tension underneath of this, which is this idea of solving problems with trust versus solving them with rules. And I think sometimes instead of having a direct conversation or empowering people to make better decisions, we have this natural default tendency to just add more process. And when that happens over and over again, people stop feeling trusted and start feeling controlled. So have you ever encountered that where you saw a rule or policy that was added that didn't add value or maybe even made things worse?
Yeah, it's funny because oftentimes what when it doesn't add value and makes things worse, it's twofold, right? One is that the policy is usually half baked or just explicitly bad. And two is that the enforcement is also either half baked or non-existent. So like
Hmm.
I remember I was working for an organization where the project management methodology was like their own bespoke version of Scrummerfall is kind of what I would call it, right? So this was a consulting gig, right? So everything ends up always being relatively waterfall just by the nature of the way consulting organizations work, right? Because you do have fixed price, fixed timeline, usually fixed scope. Um, and the issue was that one, it was poorly defined. Two, it was kind of unrealistic overall, right? It was like everything in the kitchen sink from like a project management methodology point of view. And then three, it was never enforced other than it was something that you had to engage in with your kickoff deck. So what would happen is like inevitably, like all professional services engagements, spoiler alert, this is every engagement in my experience. Things go wrong because things always go wrong, and then you would like harp on the process. Well, you need to let me see your work breakdown structure and your Gantt charts and all these other things and your notes from your daily stand-ups and all these things that are like don't really combine and that everyone wasn't doing. So then they would waste a whole bunch of time trying to get all of the pieces together to retrofit the project to the process that had been defined, but the process didn't solve the problems. All it was kind of a giant CYA form, and the problems that would come up were relatively unique each time. So like adherence to the process wasn't going to reduce the risk overall. It was just kind of became additional overhead. And I'm guessing, Ed, you've probably had a million times where you've been in this exact situation, right? This is kind of a pretty prototypical project management sort of thing. And it comes down to what I said at the beginning, right? Lack of thoughtfulness as to what the process was and how it was designed, and lack of thoughtfulness as to how it was reinforced or institutionalized, right? And then it just becomes a cudgel to kind of browbeat people. Well, things are broken because you didn't follow the process, and if you had followed the process, things wouldn't be broken. But the two things are not the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. The PMO is a great example. I mean, I can think of, so I won't, this is not a commentary on whether raid logs are good or bad or anything to that extent, but the number of times that I've been involved in some sort of project management organization or working with a project manager, and the first question is about the raid log or whether this was in the raid log. And it's like I'm trying to have a thoughtful discussion about what's going on or the problem. And the question isn't about the actual problems. It's just, well, did you do the process of the raid log to make sure it's in there? It kind of makes the value of that not as meaningful. And then I'll see people adding all sorts of nonsense to the RAID log, and not even identifying the difference between like a risk and an issue, because it's not about whether you're doing it in an effective or useful way. It's just about getting the thing done and documenting it. And it ultimately doesn't have the value that I think they intended for it to have.
Yeah, the RAID log, I think, is a great example of this, and I'm in the process of instituting a mechanism with my team that's it's a reporting mechanism on their sector of the business, right? And it's the reasons I want to implement this is I want them to think about their business in a very specific way, and this mechanism, it's what I would think of as an enabling constraint to get them to think that way. And the other part is I just like to consume data in a very specific way. And it's my team, so I can make them provide the data in the format that I want to consume it in, because those are the things that you get to have when you are the direct leader of a team. And I was writing through and I was writing instructions because I'm going to have to teach them how to use this mechanism, right? And that's because you always do, right? That's how you institute change and institute bureaucracy and mechanisms, generally speaking. And one of the things I wrote in it was for one quadrant, if this is like a 2 by 2 matrix that I'm asking them to use, I said, focus not just on reporting the weather, but I want to know the so what, right? And a RAID log is a great example of that breakdown, right? A RAID log, like understanding your risks and whatnot, is a great thing, and having a plan to mitigate those risks is a great thing and really, really important. If you just have a list of all of your risks, you're just reporting the weather. And like, I don't need you to report the weather. I don't need to know that it's like whether or not it's sunny outside. Like, I have a window in my room, right? I think we often don't get to that second order thing, and that's, I think, where bureaucracy breaks down. Is we do the first order thing, which is, well, we have this process and I did the process. The process says I need to have a RAID log, so I built a RAID log. So what? We never get to so what.
Yeah. And I think this is where leadership really comes into play in a really big way, because in a lot of cases, it's not just the system; it's the way the leaders are using it. So sometimes I think leaders lean too hard on bureaucracy, and I think sometimes it's to avoid something that they're uncomfortable with, whether that might be a hard decision or a difficult conversation. And instead of resolving tension or trusting their people to make the right decisions with the context and the information, they drop in a new policy. And suddenly it stops feeling like leadership support and it starts feeling like control. So to
Mhm.
me, the real leadership mistake isn't just using bureaucracy. It's like we talked about before, it's either overbuilding it in the name of safety or tearing it down without fully understanding what it was protecting in the first place. So I think that there are some common traps that I see. One of them is adding process to prevent hypothetical future problems that haven't actually happened but might happen. So we want to head them off. Using policy as a workaround to avoid giving feedback or having an uncomfortable conversation with someone. I see that happen a lot. Killing a process without understanding what it was holding together, maybe quietly, and now something falls apart unexpectedly. Trying to automate trust or culture with formal rules, just thinking like, oh, if we just put formal rules in place, that will build cultural, that will build trust. And that almost never works. Or just letting layers of process pile up over time because no one ever goes back to prune them, and we're not prioritizing it because it's no one's job to do that. It's like excess work, and people have the job that they are paid to do, so no one has an expectation that anyone is doing that cleanup. And for me, at that point, bureaucracy isn't a design decision anymore. It's a crutch basically, and it's something that leaders would lean on when they're afraid of judgment, inconsistency, or any kind of human friction. So, what do you think about that, Andy? Do you think leaders sometimes use it as a crutch or even as a shield from having to lead directly or do something hard?
Yeah, and I mean, it, it's way easy to like paint with a super broad brush here, Ed. But let's kind of go back to the example that we've been throwing around, right? All these PMO examples, because that's a place that we're intimately familiar. And I think it often gets used as a crutch there in what I would call CYA behaviors, right? So we're going to document this so that when something goes wrong, I can say I've got it documented, and I don't need to take the ownership
Hmm.
of it. And I see this super frequently Anything that you would feel as a CYA is probably bad bureaucracy, or it's probably a workaround to keep you from having to actually take ownership of something. And I'm sure that there are a million other examples, but yeah, I think it's pretty ubiquitous. And oftentimes it's just like it's the path of least resistance, or the path of like least work, and it's not thoughtful or considerate. It's not well thought out overall.
Yeah.
And I think that it's usually super frustrating for everyone involved, right? Because then it becomes BS work for everyone, right? And then it's just like not effective.
Yeah. And that can be a really tough dynamic to navigate. Because once we recognize that bureaucracy could become a crutch, the question becomes, well, what does healthy intentional structure actually look like? How do we design systems that support people without piling on unnecessary steps or slowing everything down? I would say I think it starts with a mindset shift, like we already talked about. If we just change how we view bureaucracy and say good bureaucracy is not about control, it's about clarity, and it's a tool, just like any tool, it works best when we use it with purpose. So I guess here's where I land with it. I would say the first thing is start by asking, what problem are we trying to solve? Because if you don't know what problem you're trying to solve, then you probably maybe you don't even need to do anything at this point. If you can't define the problem, then you're not going to know if the solution worked or not. Then, once you know what problem you're trying to solve, I personally believe in going for the lightest touch possible first. Maybe it's a shared expectation or a simple checklist or just a culture nudge. And this is that idea of borrowing from Kanban principles, kind of starting with what we do now and agreeing to evolutionary and incremental change. We don't need to pile all the new rules or bureaucracy on at once. We could just try one little change. Um, if in the earlier I give the example of like, oh, somebody checked out a document and then somebody else needed it and didn't know where it was. Our natural inclination might be, well, let's make a sign up sheet. But maybe the first thing we could try is just saying, hey, if you check out this document, make sure you get it checked back in as quick as possible so that it's not checked out when someone else needs it and you're not available or something like that. And so that would be really, that's like the smallest intervention that could work. Maybe it's informal, maybe it's lightweight, but if you do it with a light touch and a smallest intervention, then it makes it easy to change. It makes it easy to see if it's making the positive impact that you want it or not. And then if not, you can make adjustments to it or remove it completely, and it doesn't have as big of an impact as like a heavy process. And it's not as much effort for you up front. You just start with something small. You don't have to put a lot of planning and design into it. It's just a small amount of design, and then you can quickly pivot and change. And then the last thing I would say is only add processes when it's truly needed, and only as much as the problem actually calls for. No more or no less. Because good bureaucracy should be flexible and adjustable. It should be something that evolves as your team or your environment changes, or your situation. It should be considered a living infrastructure and not something that's fixed, or it's not concrete. We're not like pouring it and having it dry and now it's really difficult to change what we've designed. But that also means it can't be one and done, that we should revisit every process regularly, not assume it's permanent because it solved something once. And I think ultimately, if we design it well, bureaucracy will make things smoother, create alignment, reduce friction, and support momentum and enable the work instead of blocking it or slowing it down like a lot of people think bureaucracy does. So I know you've done a lot of work helping orgs set up systems. What do you think makes for a healthy process in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think you covered a lot of ground on that, Ed, right? The idea that it should be a living infrastructure and it should be changeable. I think a healthy process, it also, to a certain extent, like the organization, like there needs to be institutional knowledge as to when to just not do it or when to work around it, right? Which is part of that healthy infrastructure. But generally speaking, one of the big things too with a lot of these processes is, the gripe is like, oh, if we have to do all these processes, we're going to slow down. And people think that that's a bug. And I think that that's a feature, right? And I'm not saying that it should like slow you down meaningfully to the point where, you're satisfying a request in days when it could be satisfied in hours, right? But I think the processes should slow us down just enough to think about what's coming through, right? So to think about, are we actually going to go and solve the right problem? Is this something that we really want to do, right? Like the order is ready, aim, fire, not ready, fire, aim. And I think that our processes should should be built with that in mind, right? So trying to eliminate the opportunities to do ready, fire, aim, and trying to make sure that we always do ready, aim, fire with things, right? So that enables us to be fleshed out before we do it. It enables better decision making, ideally using things like, I don't know, like an Eisenhower matrix or whatnot, to figure out what are the decisions that we need to make urgency and where we can take a little bit more time, right? Rather than just kind of machine gunning everything out there and doing everything as to total chaos. So that to me is really the key, right? Like we should be, the speed limit's 65, right? We should cap ourselves at 65 or at 70 if you drive, or 75 if you like to drive a little bit fast, but certainly shouldn't be driving 90. It's a great way to get a ticket, right? That's the way I think that we need to think about these processes, and they need to be enabling constraints to allow us to get things done without getting ourselves into a whole bunch of trouble or without going down the wrong path for too long.
Yeah, and I know we've been focused on organizational bureaucracy, and that is where I want to keep our focus. But just thinking about this idea of intentionally slowing us down with bureaucracy, if we think about government, everybody associates government with bureaucracy, and a lot of people talk about government bureaucracy like it is a bug. Oh, it makes things slow, or we aren't changing things that frequently, but that's definitely designed as a feature, because if every time we had a new administration or a change in any one person, everything was able to change in a really rapid way in 2 years or 4 years, it'd be untenable, it'd be unsustainable. And you don't want those changes to be just on impulse or rapid like that. You want them to for something that impacts so many people in such a big system, you want those changes to build up over time until they gain enough force behind them that it does become something we should move forward with. And sometimes that can be frustrating, because certainly there's times I'd like the government to move faster on certain things too. But I think ultimately having that those extra steps and those checks and balances and being a little bit slower and a little bit more deliberate means when something finally does pass as a law or changes in government, it means that it probably had a lot of vetting behind it and a lot of decisions that went into it, instead of just being kind of an impulse change that could negatively impact a lot of people in a short period of time. And I guess I would think of it as it's sort of like pruning a tree, right? With bureaucracy. When we're doing that, the point isn't that we're trying to cut it down or destroy it. It's that we're trying to shape it and help it grow in the right direction so that it does what we want and doesn't grow out of control. Um, so yeah, I think that's a perfect way for us to land this conversation, because when we talk about bureaucracy, we're not talking about systems. We're talking about how leaders make decisions, shape culture, and guide growth, and the impact that it has on the people who work there. And that brings me to one last question for you, Andy. What advice would you give to a new leader who's trying to figure out how much process is too much or not enough?
Yeah. So I'm going to paraphrase one of our former coworkers on this. And actually, I'm just going to call him out by name, because I feel like he has instituted himself as a mythical creature, for better and sometimes for worse in our space. And I feel like we know him well enough that we can say we're talking about Jim here. And Jim would always ask, whenever we were talking about any processes or anything that we're doing, how would you know that it worked, right? And I think that's such a great observation and a great place to start, right? So I wouldn't even think of I would think, how would I know that I've solved the problem? And then I would work my way backwards from that. So like, the problem is solved. What are the steps that we did to solve it? And what is the lightest weight version of that, right? And I would think of it like an experiment, right? Think, what is the least amount of things that I could do to solve this problem, and how would I know that it's done, right? So I I've got very little kids, and they get changed in all parts of the house. We just have like clothes thrown over the house. I'm tired of going around and picking them up all the time. So how could I solve that? Well, I could put a basket at the base of the stairs that we just take upstairs and throw in the kids' hamper when they throw socks and, all sorts of, decide that all of a sudden it's toddler naked time, right? We could do that. And the way that we would know that that is solved is there would be fewer clothes on the floor, or there would be clothes in the basket. Right? You can think about like, what is the lightest weight thing that we can do, right? The heaviest weight thing we could do is implement a draconian punishment system for my toddlers, where every time they leave a sock on the floor, we sentence them to 3 months in a gulag or something like that, right? It's not going to be super effective. Obviously, I'm being hyperbolic, but that's the way I would think about things, right? Is how would I know that it's solved? And then what is the smallest adjustment that I can make to get me to that end state?
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, that's great. I think that goes along with the, what you have to understand what problem you're facing, and then you need to understand what what would it look like if that problem didn't exist anymore. And I think those are some base questions to ask that'll get
Yeah,
you in the right
it's
direction.
never a toddler gulag.
All right. Well, as we wrap up, here's what we explored today. Bureaucracy gets a bad rap, and sometimes it deserves it. It can slow things down, frustrate teams, and become a tool for avoidance, but it's also a powerful design choice. When done well, bureaucracy acts like an external brain, preserving memory, reducing decision fatigue, and helping organizations scale without falling into chaos. When done poorly, it becomes bloated, rigid, and reactive, a backpack full of rocks from past mistakes. We talked about the difference between enabling constraints and dead weight, why trust can't be automated with rules, and how leaders can avoid overbuilding or tearing things down without a plan. So here's your challenge this week. If you're thinking about adding or removing a process, ask yourself 2 questions. What problem are we solving, and how will we know if it worked? We'd love to hear where you've seen bureaucracy help or hurt in your own leadership journey. Email us at leadershipexplored@gmail.com or connect with us on LinkedIn. Thanks for exploring leadership with us today on Leadership Explored. We release new episodes every other Tuesday. Be sure to follow, share with a colleague, and until next time, keep leading with purpose.